couple of hours to concentrate on our lower achievers and the teaching sequence for writing. So I am assuming that everybody who is on this call today has been on some form of training for the teaching sequence. If there are schools that haven't attended the sequence at all, I think you're going to get an overview really through the 2 hours. But please contact me if you want further information on the teaching sequence, and my email is on the front slides there, and Elaine will be getting those out to you when this has finished today. So yeah, let's have a look at our aims, Elaine, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. So these are the things I want to cover, really. When I do the teaching sequence training with everybody, when we talk about all year groups, I don't make any excuses that the teaching sequence is really designed for those children who struggle with writing. I talk about not really aiming this at our greater depth pupils, because those more able pupils are quite often the ones that have a really good starting point. They come from talking families, they're read to from birth, they have an excellent vocabulary when they come to school, and therefore writing is if not easy, it is more natural to those children. I often talk about children who are not finding writing easy. And we need to look really at those children. And I've called them our lower achievers. Obviously, we've got our lowest, we've got our 20% of pupils who are not are struggling with barriers to learning, SEND barriers or EAL barriers. But we've also got those children who are potential ARE, but constantly stick at working towards. And those children are also what I would term as our lower achieving children in the classroom. I want to talk a little bit about transcriptional fluency. Now, when I last did this webinar, which would have been a couple of years back, transcriptional fluency was very new. It was something that was quite...
Okay, Carter.
Hello, Louise. Did you want to say something? Oh, no, okay. The transcriptional fluency is something that has been we've used a lot now. It's part of the writing framework as foundational knowledge. So lots and lots of schools are now getting their heads around the foundational fluency, and I will cover very briefly in the steps of dictation, but that is not what this is all about. But it is part of it, and obviously those children who are lower attainers in writing, it is quite often their transcription that holds them back. That is their pencil control, that is their letter formation, their spelling, and their grammar as they get older. I want to talk about the importance of oral rehearsal. I always talk about the importance of oral rehearsal in every single session that I do, because I think it is extremely important that we have a 50-50% balance between transcription and oracy. And I will go through that briefly as well. So if you've been on training with me, those are things that we might have covered in the past, and something I want to delve a little bit deeper into for our lower attainers. Then I want to talk about teaching assistant support and how those lower attainers are often supported in schools. And I want us to have a think about how we either currently support our lowers, or how we want to further support our lower attaining children. And I just want us to reflect really on that, and whether there are ways that we can support our children better than perhaps we do presently. But we'll talk about that at the end. Thanks, Elaine. So this is a piece of writing you may or may not have seen before. This is a very small section of writing from a child called Wellington, who is a year 6 writer. And his writing here is from September, year 6. So this is his first sort of foray into writing from year 6. And I want us to really look at his strengths and weaknesses. So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes, 1 or 2 minutes, to have a look at that. I wonder if you could write in the chat something that you have spotted, whether it's a strength or a weakness that you have spotted about Wellington's writing. Pop it down in the chat and we'll have a look at his writing in about a minute or so. Thank you, guys. Just looking at your chat, that's really, really interesting, the things that you have pulled out there. We've got good use of language. I think the vocabulary choices that Wellington has made are fairly strong. If you look at the fact that he used chaos to begin with, but then crossed it out to use anarchy, although he capitalized it, is quite an interesting. He's used furious instead of cross. He's also used a simile. So the vocabulary choices there have been used. Now, this school uses the teaching sequence, and of course, the first part of the teaching sequence is the immersion, which is where we look at our vocabulary choices and we give the children a range of vocabulary from which to choose. And I do think Wellington has been able to do that. He has been able to use his word bank. He's been able to use the word choices and the synonyms that he's been given and use them in the correct context. So it shows that the teaching sequence there is in place and is working. What isn't working for Wellington so much is the bits that he has to do on his own, really, which is more to do with his choices in terms of transcription. And lots of you have mentioned this in your chat, so thank you very much for that. Capital letters in the middle of sentences, beaming, capitalized. He's got mistakes in his use of full stops. He's got a capital W, and so therefore it doesn't sit in the ARE range of Y6, even though he has been able to use a parenthesis and a semicolon. Elaine, would you move it on to the next slide, please? So you see there, we have got his range of strengths and weaknesses. So he's got parenthesis, he has a semicolon, chaos up level to anarchy, he has used a simile, so that's good. But that's what he has been taught on the day, if you like, of that unit. Parentheses, semicolons, and the vocabulary choices. These are all part of the teaching that was done within the sequence. What he doesn't have are those aspects of writing that were done outside of that sequence, that were taught to him way before he got to Y6. So he's still using phonetically plausible spellings when he's trying to spell unknown words. His verb tense, which somebody mentioned in the chat, is not right. His contact spelling is wrong. Was in handwriting is incorrect, and the inappropriate use of the capital letter. All of that is much, much lower down in his teaching, in his learning of writing, and he has not secured it. And by the time children get into Y6, they are at a position now where those errors, those misconceptions, if you like, have become embedded. And it's really difficult to move children who are at this point of their writing. We need to catch this much, much earlier. We need to identify these children much, much earlier. And the writing framework from July talks about that. They talk about the fact that we need to identify these children much earlier, even if we can, those who have potential issues with writing from reception. That way we can put into place those additional intervention, additional or adaptations for them so that they can achieve in writing and don't become Y6 writers like Wellington. Thank you. Thanks, Elaine. I just wanted to share with you some writing outcomes of a school. Those of you who've been on training with me, you'll know that I work in schools quite a bit. Most of the time now is about supporting schools with the teaching sequence. However, I do work in a couple of schools where I teach, and I am part of the sort of the teaching staff and responsibility for outcomes. And this is the school, one of the schools I work in. And although it's in challenging circumstances, these are the outcomes that we have. And you've got there in black are the children who achieved the ARE for that particular year group using the teacher assessment. So, for instance, in year one, 43% of children got ARE, leaving 57% of those children that did not, and that 43% is ARE and above. 54 for year two, 57 for year three, 56, 50, and 62 for year six. But what I think is interesting, I think is more beneficial for us, is terms of thinking about children who are not achieving well in writing, is actually how many children are we looking at? Because if you think about how many children we're looking at, we're not looking at a group of 6 children that go outside with a TA. We're looking at a lot of children who are not achieving where they should be in terms of age-related expectation. For instance, in year one, that's 34 pupils. 34 pupils in a cohort of 60 that are not achieving where they are. Now, if they're not achieving, that gap has already opened. That gap is opened, and it will potentially, if we don't catch it early enough, that potentially it will get wider. And so therefore we need to be really acutely aware of what those children are doing, those difficulties they have, and how we can adapt their learning so that those gaps close. And one of the ways we are going to close those gaps is by concentrating much more on the basics, the foundational knowledge, rather than the writing outcomes in terms of text type that we would have had some 2 years ago, really, and in some cases, in some schools last year, until the writing framework came out. Thank you. So we have seen this before if you've been on training, and it is just the simple view of writing. The simple view of reading shows the 2 cognitive processes you need for reading. This is the same for writing. And the 2 cognitive processes children need when they are learning to write is transcription and composition. They need to be able to compose a sentence in order to be able to write a sentence. And then they need to be able to have the mechanical skill of picking up the pencil and letter formation, spaces between words, spelling, punctuation, for it to become a written sentence. Children who are transcriptionally fluent can do that. They can compose a sentence and write that sentence that they want to write with fairly good letter formation, spelling, and spacing between words. Many children in year one who are not transcriptionally fluent simply because of the age that they are, which is interesting in that we're not really expecting our children in year one to be transcriptionally fluent. They're only learning to write at this stage. But what we've been doing historically is expecting our year one children to do so much more than write a sentence. And that has held a lot of the children back and led to us as practitioners over scaffolding so that those children can achieve what we think are our good outcomes, our non-chronological report, our newspaper report, those sorts of things. We've pulled that right back now in terms of writing in year one. And what we do now is we would be very much focused on the very simple, basic sentence writing, trying to get that right for our children so that they can then compose and write what they want and become transcriptionally fluent. But we do have an expectation that year one is not transcriptionally fluent. So when we look at sort of transcriptional fluency in year one, it's a whole class issue. However, after year one, it starts to become an issue for fewer children. So that gap starts to open. And the gap starts to open, and because of that,
recording in progress.
Hi, Dean. Thank you. And because of that gap that opens up, we are then looking at children in each year group, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, that are now are still not transcriptionally fluent. And so therefore they are our lower achieving children. And we need to look at how we can support them in terms of not the whole class, but a group of children very often. Thanks, Elaine. So just a message from Kirsty Godfrey. You'll have seen this before if you've been on training with me. She's our senior His Majesty's Inspector for English. And she very much supports this idea of writing being composition and transcription, and that children should not be asked to do things they cannot do. And this is something that we have had for a significant number of years. I've been teaching for 30 years, and we have done this for, I would say, 25 of those 30 years. We have looked at all of our children producing very, very similar outcomes, and therefore leading children to doing things they cannot do. She talks very much about the fluent transcription. She talks about the oral composition, helps pupils' understanding of language. But she also talks about the fact that if pupils are struggling with the process of writing, asking them to do further extended writing is unlikely to be effective. And one of the things we will explore in this meeting today is, what do we ask our lower achievers to do? Is it something that actually they cannot do, and so therefore is ineffective in making them better writers? We need to spend more time practicing the components of writing that need attention, which is what she said. And she said that in a conference in March, it's 2 years ago now, but it was not so long ago. Thanks, Elaine. So very, very quickly, I'm sure you know this by now because it is something we've talked about, and the writing framework also talks about what is transcriptional fluency. It is the ability to be able to write with automaticity the sentence composed by the pupils themselves. Children are not transcriptionally fluent until they can do that. The sentence will contain words spelled correctly and with the correct letter formation. We need to think about letter formation. How many pupils in each subsequent year group from year one have incorrect letter formation? And then we ask them to join letters in readiness for the year 6 in writing, and the year 2 greater depth, actually. And it very much states in the writing framework now that pupils should not be expected to join their letters until their print is the right, the formation is correct, starting in the right place, finishing in the right place, and correct sizing to each other. So we need to really make sure that we get that right in the early part of their learning, rather than leaving that to just get, well, not maybe not get worse, but not get any better as they go through Key Stage 2, because quite often the amount of time we spend on handwriting in Key Stage 2 depletes. And those children who have poor letter formation continue with poor letter formation. Thank you. Um, Above everything, I do believe that one of the things we need to make sure we are consistently thinking about is the oracy of our pupils and the oral rehearsal of their writing, because um, this is the level playing field that our lower achievers can really excel at sometimes. Because when we have children who have low abilities in writing, as I've said before, it's often the transcription that is the problem. The speed at which they write, the stamina they have for writing, their pencil grip, their letter formation, spelling, making sense, etc. When we have, if we have just a commitment to teaching that when we teach writing, we will consistently be teaching children things they cannot do. And I think that's where we've had a negative attitude to writing with our lower attainers for a number of years. But I think when we look at oracy and we look at the attention to oracy, that lifts our children out of that sort of lower attaining, because we can get all of our children to speak at the highest level. And we do that through modeling. We do it through us talking and speaking sentences, getting the children to model those sentences and repeat them back to you so that they hear themselves having a writer's voice. Very often our children don't have a writer's voice when they begin to write. They write as they speak. And because when they speak in fragments, they speak in dialects as well that can quite often have incorrect verb tense, which is absolutely fine in spoken language. But we are talking about oral rehearsal for language, oracy for writing. We need to have that writer's voice that we innately have when we begin writing. Our children don't necessarily have that. They don't have that because they're not used to it. If our children were readers, then our pupils would then read books, and then they would have this innate writer's voice that would come out when they are writing. I think probably that's what happened when I was a kid. I would read and then I would write, and my writing would sound like I read. I didn't need to know what I was doing necessarily. I didn't need to know it made sense or it didn't make sense. I didn't know whether it was a conjunction or a subordinate clause I was writing. It just seemed to flow because I knew what it sounded like. Our pupils aren't like that now. It's no surprise, I suppose, that our better writers are often our readers. So therefore, they have that writer's voice. But we've got children, and you know you've got children that don't. And so what we need that concentration on oracy that gets those children to speak like a writer. It develops the vocabulary. You're not accepting the lowest form of words. You are only accepting in their spoken language those words that you're teaching during the immersion. This is the whole point of the teaching sequence. We are getting those children to speak at the highest level. We wouldn't necessarily expect them to write at that level, but we are going to get them to speak at that level. It also extends their sentences. Many children do not speak in full sentences. They speak in fragments. The energy needed to say full sentences is really quite a lot. And we need children to be able to compose sentences fully in one go in their brain before we're going to ask them to write them. So what we get them to do is we get them to say them, we get them to practice them, to rehearse them, because that way they are more likely to then write them. Remember the old adage, it's been around for years: think a sentence, speak a sentence, write a sentence. If you can't think the sentence, you can't speak it, you're not going to write it. Thanks, Elaine. So I've got three little slides here that just shows the relationship between oracy and transcriptional fluency. You've seen these before if you've been on training. I just want to look at it in terms of our lower achievers, where we have the expectation that our oracy is at the highest level, and that is for all pupils. That is your level playing field. That is where everything is modeled, rehearsed. Children can achieve the highest levels of spoken language. It's really good to record your lowers doing oracy work in the classroom, particularly when you're in a situation where you are asking them to compose sentences, because quite often their written work does not reflect what they can compose orally. A couple of reasons why that happens. One of the reasons is that they quite often have this relationship with writing that they will not write what they can compose, they will write what they can spell. And so therefore, because their letter formation and their speed at which they write and their stamina is low, they will then make sure that what they are writing is at a low level so that they can achieve it. If you have a recording of what children can do in competent oracy terms, you may find that they are different in terms of what they write and what they speak. So I would get a device and I would do that. And that's really good evidence, actually, in terms of what are the difficulties the lower achievers are facing. Is it transcriptional fluency? Because actually, when they speak, they can say sentences, they can compose a sentence. I was watching a year one class on Monday, and they were doing oral rehearsal and they were doing composition for a picture. And they started off with I can see, and it was a picture of a farm. And I can see a cow. I can see a bird. I can see. And then the teacher said that she didn't want any I can sees anymore. And she wanted to have sentences that began with the animal. So there was a child who contributed a sentence who would not be able to write. And I know the child well. He would not be able to write. But he said, the pig is fat. And then he said, he stopped and he went, no, the pink pig is fat. And that was a real breakthrough because actually he orally composed a sentence and it was a complete sentence. And not only that, he changed that and put the adjective in front of the noun. And that was a real breakthrough. He would not be able to write that because his letter formation is foundation stage. So it was really good to see that he can do that. So our transcriptional fluency in EYFS and Key Stage 1 is very low. Everything that we write in EYFS and Key Stage 1 is at a simple level that the children can use their phonics to enable them to spell and enable them to be able to CVC words, be able to write, be able to spell, be able to put the space in between. Bit like the phonetically plausible books that contain graphemes that the children have now. So it's exactly the same principle. Oracy alongside it is at the highest level. Can we move on one, please? So the lower Key Stage 2, what happens here when we've got lower Key Stage 2 is that the oracy remains, but transcription improves. So our oracy remains at the highest level. So it continues to build from Key Stage 1. But because our grammar conventions are becoming more detailed and more complex, our writing becomes more complex. So we start to put in conjunction, we start to put in adverbs and adverbials. We start to put in expanded noun phrases. And so our writing becomes more detailed. Our oracy should also reflect that, but also contain things that we're not teaching at that level because our grammar is broken down into very specific year group progression. But we can speak at any standard in terms of that because what we're doing again is that writer's voice. So our transcription gets better, but our oracy stays very, very high. Thank you. And eventually in upper key stage 2, what we want is our oral rehearsal and our oracy and our transcriptional fluency to match. So what we've done is we have spent time teaching our children to learn to write. We've taught them how to apply spelling rules. We've taught them how to do the grammar. We've taught them the letter formation, the simple punctuation, the more complex punctuation when we get into key stage 2. And alongside that, we have been teaching our children to speak with a writer's voice at the highest possible level. At the end of year 6, that transcriptional fluency has been taught. Everything that child says now should be a written convention that they can now write. So therefore, it matches. That is when those children are ARE, where everything matches and we are speaking and writing at the same level. If you think about your lower achievers, you think about Wellington, he could do what he was taught transcriptionally, semicolon parentheses, but he has a lag behind. That lag of the very simple stuff being not being at that point. So therefore, he can't speak and write what he says because of that lag of transcriptional fluency. So that's why, in terms of if our oracy is 50% of our learning in writing, we can manage that through our classroom and we can manage that whole class. What we've got to look at is what is it about the writing process that we need to support our children in so that that lag, that gap that has opened closes as soon as possible and our lower attainers start to achieve and start to achieve so that they become more confident about their writing. Thank you. So what we do then, I'm going to do this very quickly, is the pre-dictation 5 steps of dictation. This is the process by which we have, in the teaching sequence, what I have chosen to put in terms of a system that teaches children to become transcriptionally fluent. There is nothing statutory about this system. This is something that I have developed over time, last couple of years with teaching staff, trying to come to a way of teaching children the foundational knowledge in a way that can be handled in the classroom. So what we do is we place our children on the 5 steps of dictation. And in terms of that, there are really 5 ways of approaching sentence writing with different children. And at any point in the year, they will be placed on it will mean whether they are in a lower achieving or not. So for instance, if this was a year 1 class, this would be a whole class situation. However, as we go up through the years, fewer children are placed on the 5 steps, and that is because those are the children that struggle with transcription. These children who are in front of us now are pre-dictation 1 children. These are the children who, if we said the sentence they wanted some food, which is from Stone Soup, they would not be able to write it. Their ability to write letters kind of prevents them from writing anything. They have very, very poor motor skills. And so therefore their spacing and their sizing of letters is poor. I actually probably wouldn't give them handwriting lines at this stage if they were pre-dictation 1. They need the space to be able to form the letters, but I would be looking at demonstrating and modelling to them how to form each individual letter. I had a chat with an Ofsted inspector about this sort of thing because I think one of the nervousness we get about this sort of transcriptional emphasis is that children are not particularly writing very much. And I spoke to them about a year 2 child, and we looked at some writing of a year 2 child who was a lower attainer in a classroom. And we looked at the writing, and the writing wasn't very good, and the handwriting, letter formation was poor. And the inspector, before I even mentioned it, said, "What is the point of doing anything until you can write your letters properly?" So I asked him, "Would you be happy, therefore, with this child's book to be letter formation practice?" And he said, "What else are you going to do?" And I think that's right. I think that's something that I probably have struggled with over time in terms of not giving children what they need practice because of evidence or sort of this idea that they need to have lots of writing in their books. Therefore, what I'm giving them is copying because that's how I can get lots of writing in their books. But actually, what we need is for them to really practice what they can't do. Back to Kirsty Godfrey's slide where she said they need to individually practice the components that they can't do. So I think I'm comfortable now with that because I think that with this emphasis on foundational knowledge, we have the Ofsted clearance to be able to do that. And I know there has been inspections. I'm not many, but there have been inspections that have had. We've been with schools that have been doing this system, and it has come out really well in terms of yes, you are focusing on the foundational knowledge, which is really what they want to see, particularly in Key Stage 1. Can we move on, please? So predictation 2. There are 3 ways of doing predictation 2, and that is where we give the children the dual coding, which is the widget that you've got in front of you, which has symbols and pictures to support their memory of the sentence that they want to write. Historically, widget is an EAL tool to support children whose English is not their first language. But actually, in terms of hold a sentence for dictation, it's actually a really good tool in terms of helping children. And we've got 3 forms there. We've got the first one, which is the lowest end of it, where you give the widget plus the words. The children here are really struggling with remembering each individual word because each individual word takes so much cognition to be able to write. They forget the rest of the sentence. So what we do there is we get the children to read the sentence and say it over and over again, but then it is there for them to copy. They copy it in their handwriting, so they are actually practicing their letter formation. We don't ask them to write over the line, over someone else's handwriting, because they need to practice their own letter formation, not someone else's. And so therefore we ask them to do it. But what the widget does really well is it spaces the words out for the children. So they can, if they write underneath each widget tile, their spacing becomes better. And that is something that a lot of children who struggle find difficult. They find they write in one homogeneous line of writing. But we can't do that. We can't stay there. The whole point is to move on and to get better. And so we get better by getting the children then to cognitively engage a bit more in their writing. And so rather than copying, they then have the 1 or 2 words missing, which is the next stage up on dictation 2, where we leave out either a common exception word, which they can find on their word map in front of them, or a phonemically plausible word that they could use. So in this case, food, because it's the most phonetically plausible, they could work out how to spell. And so they then write those words into that sentence underneath. And so therefore they've still got the letter formation, they've still got the spacing, but now they're rehearsing their spelling. The one underneath that is those children who are able to write the sentence, they wanted some food, but the amount of cognition needed for each individual word is so much that they often forget. So therefore they have the dual coding, the pictures there to support them remembering the word. But actually they do have spacing, simple spelling, largely correct letter formation. So they can write that sentence. They just need a little bit more support. We then move on to those who are more able in their writing. Elaine, if you could just move us on. And these would be more able children if they were in year one. However, if we look at the elements of each of these, then looking at that in terms of 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, these children would still be sitting really in our lower achieving group. So these children are the children who need a sentence dictated, because if they compose their own sentence and try and write their own sentence, they will not think about their transcriptional skill. So they don't have an equal amount of brain activity on both composition and transcription. Actually, as soon as they compose that sentence, transcription will take over, push the composition out, and they will then forget the sentence that they have written. Or the other way is they will compose a sentence, and because they are holding that sentence and not letting that sentence go, they don't think about any transcription. And so you have no capital letters, no spacing, letter formation goes down in terms of individual letters, spacing disappears. And so you get then a page, if you like, of writing no one can read. So the children who do that, either of those need to be dictated to. So the dictated group are those children who, if they were given a simple sentence, they would be able to hold it, say it, repeat it, and then write it with somebody else holding it for them as well. So the teacher holding it, the teaching assistant holding it, or a device holding it. So those children who are lower retainers in Key Stage 2, so dictation is really where the gap is opened and you're trying to close the gap of transcription. You can get children to compose their own sentences, but then they speak into a device, because that way they will then, that sentence is then held for them. It's the holding the sentence in their head and writing the sentence with the good transcription skill is what our lower retainers can't do. As children get better at that, then we look at children who can have the dictated sentence, but then insert either words, vocabulary, or join sentences making clauses, those sorts of things, but they have a base sentence on which to work. That's quite a nice one for Key Stage 2. When you're looking at maybe working with children who are lower achievers, where you have a base sentence which you say to them and you hold for them, but they then work on that sentence to up level it slightly using some of the knowledge that they've got. It's kind of like a halfway house between composition and transcription fluency. But they have a little bit of ownership over what they're writing. Children who are independent, they can write their own sentences and are unlikely to be lower achieving children. They are not lower achievers. They are your most able in year one. And they continue quite often through school being competent writers. So if they are in year one as an independent writer, unlikely to be our lower achievers, which we are concentrating on today. Thank you. So I've just got these two slides. I'm kind of not anticipating we can really get to terms with this today, considering we've got a finite amount of time. However, we are. I just wanted to show this so that you, when you get this as part of your slides, it kind of you can have a look at it and make sense. These are two progression documents that I worked on in schools pretty recently. So since I've been doing the transcriptional fluency stuff, since the writing framework, and we've looked at what their expectations are, in order to track our children and to see whether we are on track for ARE or we are lagging behind. So this is a progression in early years, and you can see the red is the not on track. The EYFS. So I think what we got to was pre-writing shapes and patterns in autumn term. If by autumn term 2, which was last 2 weeks ago, you were still on pre-writing shapes and patterns and not forming letters, then you are not on track. So then it goes up through the terms that way. And so that's one that you might want to have a look at. I don't think it's something we can sit and sort of pore over now, but that's one that we've developed. And if you just want to move on a bit, Elaine, for me, then this is the one that I have done for a possible progression key stage 1, which shows the steps of dictation. So if you are on track in year 1, the idea being kind of you start on pre-dictation 2, so you have some form of widget support for the autumn term, but by spring term you are writing sentences that are said to you, that are held for you. And by the summer term, you're adding some sort of challenge into those sentences. Children who are above that get to independent stage by the summer term in key stage in year 1, which means they can write their own sentences. However, in the below, we may not get to that, and we might only get to the dictation stage in the summer term, and quite possibly below that, so we don't get off of pre-dictation. In year 2, it's the same sort of principle in terms of in autumn term on track. We might look at the challenge. So we would give children a sentence, but then they would alter it in some way, up level it. And very quickly from spring, and this is happening in the year 2 classes that I'm now working with, that did their year 1s did a full year of transcriptional fluency. We have now started planning, structure planning, which we would have called beyond step 5, which is, if you've been on training with me, that's what we called it. And so they're now not being dictated to at all. Those children who are below that will still need the dictation in year 2. And that is where we would then move into years 3, 4, 5, and 6 with children who are still not really independently writing. If you take that, I suppose, and then you move that into 3, 4, 5, and 6, you can see how that would be for those children who are working below. So you would have a group of children who are lower attainers, and then what you do is you would, they might be on or any of the steps, because we won't have this homogenous movement from year 1 into year 2. Because those children in year 3, 4, 5, and 6 have not had this sort of emphasis on transcriptional fluency that key stage 1 are now getting. So there could be a significant number of children. And if you look at that, if you think back to that school that I shared their data with you, 165 pupils across the school were not attaining ARE. That's a significant number of children. 34 children in year 6 were not attaining ARE. Then you're looking at a significant number of children. Do we need to progress the steps of dictation through key stage 2 at this stage to mop up and to give the children an emphasis on transcription that they did not get in key stage 1? And it's because they did that, transcription emphasis has not been taught, and they have been floundering in writing text types, in writing purposefully, doing extended writing, that actually their writing doesn't get any better, because no one's teaching them now how to write and form their letters correctly. So I think that's something we need to look at in terms of those lower attainers. What is it we need to do with them? And quite possibly what we need to do with them is we need to get them transcriptionally fluent as soon as possible. That way that we can close that gap. Thank you. Just share this with you, really, because I think this is quite an interesting quote from an Ofsted report in a school that I in Sheffield that I work in and I support, and I supported it after the Ofsted report, and they got a good, and it was quite interesting the way that in 2023 this was becoming part of an inspection process, and it's quite clear that how these gaps open and for our lower attainers. Because it talks about teachers having a good subject knowledge. They plan and teach interesting lessons that pupils enjoy. However, the work that pupils produce is variable. Teachers are not consistently addressing errors that pupils make in basic skills, such as spelling, handwriting, and punctuation. And then it talks about pupils' work across subjects contains errors in basic skills, including handwriting, punctuation, and spelling. And they're not consistently addressed by staff. Pupils repeat the same mistakes over time and hinders them from achieving as well as they should. The school needs to make sure that all staff consistently identify and promptly address pupils' errors and misconceptions. So we've got a continuous cycle of the same mistakes being made over time. And that's what we're trying to address now with the sort of the improvement, trying to make the improvements in the lower attaining children, trying to grab those mistakes early so that they don't become embedded misconceptions. The only real way we can do that is if we do that across the curriculum. And I think that's something that we need to look at, maybe another day, but to look at how our lower attainers are supported across the curriculum. Are they, for instance, expected in a history lesson to write sentences that they are not expected to write in literacy? And so therefore those errors of letter formation, errors of spelling, errors of grammar continue through the curriculum and only ever addressed in that 1 hour that they spend in literacy. And I think that might be something we need to look at. And I certainly think the inspection process will make us do that in terms of what's been happening during inspection. Thanks, Elaine. Elaine, can you remind me, is this a 6 or 6:30 finish?
6 o'clock.
6 o'clock. Okay. Just some examples of the just stuff that I've seen that I thought was quite interesting in terms of lower attainers. This is a year 1 expected child, so really looking at sort of what we get as expected in terms of year 1. We've got kind of letter formation. We're not writing on the lines correctly, but actually they've come up from reception with a good understanding of starting points for letters. The capital letters that they use are distinguished, and ascenders and descenders are clear. Most of the letters are correctly orientated, and the dictated sentence, "This is soup potato," has been written correctly. And there is spacing between words. So that is our expected. Can you move on, please? 10th of October, the year 1 expected child is now writing dictated sentences. They are sentences that are mostly within the capabilities of the child in terms of understanding the sentence, but also the words used. And I know that words like vegetables, broccoli, were given to the children so that cucumbers, so that they could spell those words without trying to spell them phonetically, which maybe they would never be able to do. It's particularly vegetables would be a difficult one to do. But you can see that the spacing is good, and that this child is learning to write those sentences within the lines that they have been given. Thank you. And we go on to February, where this child was then writing more independently. And so we've got a continuous piece of writing, and the child has told the story of Noi, the storm whale. Sentence formation is complete. Oral rehearsal transferred into transcription. So the child is beginning to compose and write their own sentences, which is fabulous. Move on then, Elaine, and let's look at the lower attainers. So this child, same activity, but you can see that the lower achieving child's letter formation is not correct. We've got sentences. If you look at the D on evil P, that the child is more drawing the letters rather than writing them in terms of starting points. And there isn't as much done in a lesson as the expected child was doing. So, and a lot more, and you can see a lot more sort of anxiety about the writing at that stage. Thank you. And by February, in terms of, we've got here in terms of the dictation and sort of the 5 steps, they have gone on to dictation. The first sentence was orally composed by the child, but copied from a whiteboard. So they're not doing that transcription themselves. The oral composition, it is a complete sentence, so that's good. But the teacher's level of support indicated is quite heavy. So in order to produce that amount of writing, the teacher's support was pretty much every part of that was not independent. Shall we move on? This is the most recent piece of Year 1 writing I've seen, which is the 7th of January. And you will remember when we do the teaching sequence in Key Stage 1 and in Year 1, we talk about independent writing and the fact that we need our children to be doing some form of independent writing. And this is a measure against the transcriptional stuff that we do. And these are 2 children in the same class on the same activity that have done their independent write. And you can see the lower attainers on the left and the more able child is on the right. And you can see the difference between the 2. And that difference and that gap that has already opened in terms of what that child is able to write independently, or will indicate very readily to anybody watching here that that child will struggle with writing and needs to be caught up as soon as possible. Thank you. Okay, so that's all the transcriptional stuff. That's all the oracy stuff, 50-50. We've done all that. Now let's look a little bit at the teaching sequence itself. And where our lower attaining children need support in the sequence and where they don't. So if we move on, Elaine, we'll look at the 2 teaching sequences and look at when the lower achievers are supported within that sequence. Thanks, Elaine. So we're going to use Jack and the Beanstalk as a mainstay. I often use Jack and the Beanstalk on training, so we'll use that one as well. But we're going to look at the teaching sequence of what is that teaching sequence for this piece of writing. Now, if you were in Year 2 to Key Stage 2, all the way through, you would be looking at the 6 steps of learning for the sequence: the immerse, analyze, skills, plan, write, and review. Jack and Beanstalk being a traditional tale doesn't mean that Key Stage 2 wouldn't necessarily write it, but we would be looking at it in terms of purpose and audience. So we might be looking at the giant being a very, very scary, intimidating character, or we might look at it in terms of a story that has an exciting middle and a really happy ending, a traditional tale. We'd analyse it through a waggle, and then we teach the grammar and the spelling that goes with it. We plan a section of the writing or the story itself, and then we would write it. And that is how we would do the teaching sequence in Key Stage 2. We'd review our writing against the purpose that we gave the children at the beginning. That's how we do it. The Year 1 teaching sequence is slightly smaller because we take out the analyze part of it. We don't need a waggle. So what we do is we immerse the children in the vocabulary of the story, necessarily give a purpose for that story. It is more about a narrative, beginning, middle, and end. We teach the grammar, the skills that needed to be able to write sentences, and then we do the writing, various forms of transcriptional dictation, and then we review our writing against it. So that is how we do the sequence for both if it was Jack and the Beanstalk. Thank you, Elaine. So what I want to talk about now, and I want to look at and sort of a feeling, thinking about when are our lower attaining children supported during the sequence? And quite often they are supported by an adult, an additional adult, although that is becoming teaching assistants are becoming rarer and rarer in classrooms, which is so sad. But there will be a need to support our lower attainers because we feel that they won't be able to do this independently. So at what point during the sequence do we do that? And if you move on, Elaine, I've kind of highlighted the bits where we do and don't. So the immersion we tend to have as a whole class activity, where children are all in, and absolutely 100% right, because our children, as I've said earlier, whether they are low attainers or not, we can speak at the highest level. We can teach our children to do that. We can teach our children new vocabulary to learn and new vocabulary to use in their spoken language. So we very rarely see those children who are vulnerable in writing being separated from the group during the immersion. But I do see them separated in the rest of the sequence, the analyze bit with the waggle, because quite often I get a question that they can't read the waggle. So what do we do about that? Do we give them a simple waggle with a TA outside the room, or do we have them in with them, so with the rest of the class? And so that's interesting. I often see when we're teaching skills, I often see our vulnerable learners are supported during that point, and quite often are doing something different during that point to everybody else. And I often see children at the writing point that are engaged either in a shared write or a supported write, quite often with an additional adult, or the teacher themselves taking that group in order to sort of guide through their writing. If those children are removed from the classroom, we often think about doing that because we think that their self-esteem will be affected by being in the classroom and not being able to do what is in the classroom, what the rest of the class are doing. And it's too high for them. I think we need to make adaptations for that, because I don't think we should really be stopping our children who are vulnerable writers experiencing a waggle that is a really good piece of writing, or learning grammar or spelling that is at age related. Can we just move on, please? So, because if we don't expose our children to the expected standards for their year group, they never will become expected standard. We will always hold those children back into those lower levels. If you look at Wellington, he was able to do what he was taught, which is the semicolons and the parentheses. He could do that in the classroom. It was the stuff underneath it that he couldn't do. If we can close that gap year on year by concentrating on transcription, we should be able to allow those children to be part of their grammar learning at the expected standard, or the waggle at the expected standard. But we would need to adapt it. And I think the way we can adapt it successfully is through the oral rehearsal. We can get children to learn what a relative clause is in year 5 by composing sentences orally with relative clauses in them. We wouldn't necessarily ask the children in our lower group to write 10 sentences with relative clauses in them, but they would be able certainly to be part of a lesson where there was an oracy link to it. Those of you that have been on the training with me, we talk about oracy linked to grammar for everybody, because one of the reasons we've got, I believe, that we've got a disconnect between grammar achieving in the GPS test at the end of Key Stage 2, and that's 90%, alongside the 72% writing scores that we get, is because our children don't speak the grammar conventions. They don't speak the way that we ask the children to learn The grammar is more like a SATs paper, more like an activity on whatever it is we're trying to learn, rather than asking them to speak sentences using the convention that we're trying to teach. Now, if we look back at that oracy right at the beginning, the leveler, where everybody can take part, you're bringing your lower achievers into a lesson that is pitched at age related. But what you're doing with them is you are not expecting them to write what they're doing. They are expected to say it. And again, this is where you can employ devices you can hold those sentences for them, and they can write then in the grammar lessons by holding them. You can record them composing so that you can assess whether they know what a relative clause is, or they can use a relative clause in a sentence. Because don't forget, it's their transcription. We are constantly trying to get better. And it's often that holds them back through speed or stamina. So I think that's a really important aspect of lower-attaining development, is we have them in as much as possible, but we don't expect them to necessarily write what everyone else is writing. It's more of an oracy outcome, if you like, with a dictation or a sentence writing, rather than multiple exposures to sentence writing, which the rest of the class would get. Thank you. So what we've got then is I want to spend the rest of the last 20 minutes I've got in terms of talking about how we deploy our teaching assistants. So apologies if you don't have a teaching assistant when you are teaching English. However, there are many of us that do, and I have over the years worked with some fabulous teaching assistants. And one of the things we need to look at is really what we give our teaching assistants to do when they are working with our vulnerable learners in terms of writing ability. And quite often what we do with them is we would ask them to complete a task. And quite often, and I know I did this more often than not, I would ask them to complete pretty much the same task that everybody else was doing. So what I would do is I would say to my teaching assistant, and my year 6 teaching assistant was called Hilary, and she was amazing. And we had a really good relationship. I would say to Hilary, I want you to take these kids and I want you to do paragraph 1, because we're doing paragraph 1 as a class. You think about that in terms of what Hilary is now having to do. So now she has removed 6 to 8 of my most vulnerable learners, and she has removed them from the classroom and taken them into a side room. I was lucky. Sometimes it's a corridor, but it's a side room. And she has the task of completing paragraph 1 with those children. And those children are vulnerable in terms of making ARE. They have an attitude to writing that they can't do it. So there's a negative attitude. And they've also learned over time that if they don't do anything, somebody is going to step in and do it for them. And what happens is Hilary has this idea that her value, her role is to get paragraph 1 back to me so that I can say that we can move on to paragraph 2 tomorrow. And that's exactly what happened. And I want to look at how we work with our vulnerable learners and how our teaching assistants are maybe given the wrong task by us. And we need to look at that. Can we move on, please, Elaine? So there you see that we have this idea there that the pressure to finish the task leads to, and what it leads to is the teaching assistant asking the child what they want to write and then writing it for them on a whiteboard, and the child copies it. What we need to do is we need to think cognitively, what can that child do? And ask them to do what they can do. So if you think, for instance, in the 5 steps of dictation, If we were on pre-dictation 2, where we had to write for a child a sentence that they composed, we wouldn't write every word for them, because some of those words they can write themselves. And it's about knowing that, and it's about taking a breath and the child expecting to have to do something when they are given that sort of whiteboard and the writing on the whiteboard. And I think that's important, because otherwise this leads to over scaffolding, and it leads to the idea that these children can write more than they actually can, because what happens is they are copying from the whiteboard, and their books are not reflecting the assessments you want to make. Because if a child is below ARE, then their book should not reflect ARE practice evidence. And quite often they do, because it's a copied activity. Thanks, Elaine. So what we need to do, we need to think about, is we need to give them a different outcome. We need to give Hilary a different outcome when she comes back to what we've asked them to do. So it's not paragraph 1, actually. It is, can you give me 4 sentences about Jack and the Beanstalk, or whatever it is you want to write, that we could include in paragraph 1, rather than writing the whole one. So I just want 4 really good sentences. And that way, Hilary has a much better chance of being able to achieve that with all the children. And it could be a dictation. So I want you to dictate these sentences to these children, but I want them to write them from your dictation. Not, I want you to write these sentences on a whiteboard and I want you to copy them. You're actually going to tell them what to write, but they have to think about every single word. That gives them much more ownership of the activity and cognitive engagement. So, but when they come back in the books, they aren't looking like they have done paragraph 1. They're actually looking like they've been practicing their transcription. And that is what is going to move those children on better than over scaffolding and copying. Thank you. So the last 15 minutes, I just want to just share with you a piece of work from a really good book called The Teaching Assistant's Guide to Effective Interaction. It's really this model, this upside down inverted triangle model of how we support children who are vulnerable. And this can be adopted not only for writing, but for supporting our lower attainers in all our subjects, that they have in group or individual support. I'm just going to go through each one of these very quickly, and you can use the slides to explore this a little bit more when you've got time. But time is against us. So I'm going to just go through them, and it'd be interesting if you share this with teaching assistants about which ones they feel they do and which ones they feel that they don't do when they are working with our vulnerable learners. So you've got self-scaffolding, which is the lowest amount of support and the highest amount of pupil independence. And we go all the way down to correcting, which is the highest level of teaching assistant support or adult support, and the lowest pupil independence. Now, this, I think teaching assistants are at the heart of that. However, I know myself as a teacher that it's quite a good reflection of how we support our lower attainers in the classroom as well, not just those that are on a group activity outside. Thanks, Elaine. So self-scaffolding then, these are our independent learners. So these children are rarely supported. And this is the goal and the aim of where we want to get our children to do. They plan how to approach a task. They problem solve, how, for instance, spelling. During the task, if their sentences don't make sense, they reread them and they rewrite them in terms of that. And they look at they read their writing and review it in terms of success related to the task. So we look at self-scaffolders, they'd be able to retell the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, They can think of the sentence and hold it while writing. They seek out the correct spelling and write the sentence at the same level they can speak. These children are not our lowest attaining children or our low attaining children. This is the goal. This is where we want our children to be. They need very little intervention by an adult when they understand the task. Thank you. Below that, we have the first steps of adult intervention. So the first step of adult intervention can be, when you ask a child what they're going to write, is actually to say nothing. Because quite often as adults and practitioners, we jump and we like to jump into support. And sometimes all our children need is a little bit extra thinking time. And then not necessarily jumping in with sentence one, but actually just saying, what do you need to write first? Because that child has lost its way in terms of what it's going to write. It's not thinking cognitively now about the writing because it's got itself confused. So therefore, you bringing it back just slightly, what do you need to write first? That's in some cases all you need to do. And then you wait to see what happens. And so that's that's a patience one. It should be called patience, not prompting. But yeah, that's one where we have a little step back and we wait. The first moment of adult intervention. Thank you. The next part, that's not worked. So therefore, what we do is we give them a clue. We're cluing. So they have the strategies, they know the story, they know the sentence construction, but they're just finding it difficult to access it. So instead of saying, let's write sentence number one, we actually think, right, okay, what's Jack doing in the first part of this story? So that leads them to the sentence construction, but it doesn't actually tell them what that sentence should be. So that's the next one. It's a little bit more adult intervention, but we're still expecting the child to come up with that sentence so that they can write and compose that sentence themselves. Thank you. Now, we might need to model. Okay, so we might be looking at doing some writing with our children who are in our group. And for instance, we have learned a new skill. In this case, it's an expanded noun phrase. So we're somewhere sitting in year 2. We're not going to give them a sentence to write. We're not going to do that. We're not going to write for them. But what we're going to do is we're going to give them a model in so that they can insert their own. So this is more like a dictation 2 model, where we've got Jack opened the curtains as our base sentence. I'm going to give that to you, but I'm actually going to ask you to put in the expanded noun phrase. So there's more intervention here by an adult than the other 2 before, but I'm actually still asking you to think. So this is where dictation 2 came in, but also in terms of cognitively engaging with the process. Thank you. And the last one is the most adult intervention, where we are, in fact, the child, this is back to Hilary outside trying to do paragraph 1 for me, is that we are going to complete the task for the child. We're going to just say, okay, you're struggling with it. I tell you what, why don't we start like this? Once there was a boy called Jack. And as soon as that you do that, the child knows that that is what you're going to do. And so they then sit back and they allow you to do that. I was watching a year 3 class on Monday, and the teacher had the children who were vulnerable learning in their classroom. She had them all sat round, and she did exactly the same thing. And she wrote the sentence on the board, and they copied the sentence and put their pens down and waited for the next sentence. What we need to do is we need to employ the sort of dictation principle as much as we possibly can in terms of that, so that even if we are going to give the children the sentence to write, we are actually asking them to think of all the spelling and the handwriting and the letter formation themselves. Okay, thank you. Now, I worked in schools on this, and I do a sort of a twilight staff meeting with teaching assistants, which is always amazingly good fun. But I asked them in terms of what they do when they are looking at working with our vulnerable learners. And although they knew, and they were very honest with me, although they knew that self-scaffolding and prompting was the one that they should be doing, they all sort of felt that the pressure to fulfill the task meant that they were correcting more than they knew that they should, and that was really their default when it came to supporting the lower attaining children. Now, that's not their fault by any means. That's where we have to, as practitioners, as teachers, really think about what we're asking them to do. Because if they're in that group, we've already made the assumption and the assessment that they can't do what everyone else is doing. So why are we asking them to? And that's what Kirsty Godfrey and the writing framework now is all about. And this is great that it all kind of marries up now with the teaching sequence in terms of how we support them. And often if they are taken out of the classroom, they're taken out of the classroom where all of the support is. I was in a lovely year one classroom on Monday that had the common exception words on the wall. She had a string of capital letters and lowercase. She had the conjunction and, so that they could demonstrate how to use it. And then those children who were vulnerable to not achieving ARE were taken out of the classroom and sat in the corridor in a base with no on the wall support, which is sad, really. And as soon as you say it to somebody, they say, of course, they need to be in. But it is quite often practice. Thank you. So really, in terms of teaching assistant deployment and how you work with a teaching assistant or anybody that supports your vulnerable learners, and indeed yourself when you are supporting your vulnerable learners in the classroom, really you just need to think of some questions to consider, really. Most of our additional support that we give is on the wall, which is what we do with a learning wall. Why are they taken away from that learning wall? Surely those children should be the ones sat right under the learning wall so that they can see it and use it to support their learning. What should a TA be asked to complete? Are we asking our weakest pupils to do what everyone else is doing? And what could we ask our TAs to do at certain points in the sequence? So could we ask them to do some oracy work on the grammar that everybody else is doing so that those children's gaps don't further open because they haven't been exposed to expected standard before the writing opportunity? And sometimes, when is it appropriate to send pupils outside to complete their learning? And sometimes it is. And we need to look at that, and we need to have a buffet menu, if you like, of when and where and what we do with the children that are lower attainers. But we really need to think about how we support them to ensure that these gaps do not open further than they have opened already, and actually closing it by concentrating on transcription is often the way we can close those gaps that the pupils have, particularly at Key Stage 2. We're trying to address it at Key Stage 1, but it's those children at Key Stage 2 that haven't had that grounding in Key Stage 1 because of the national curriculum emphasis being different in Key Stage 1 in previous years. Thank you. So if there is anything you want further on that, this is the book from which I got the that inverted triangle of support. It's a really good book to look at interaction, and it is a really valuable read. So I'm just showing you that that's where I got that information from for that research. Thank you. So we are on 6 o'clock. And I think I've covered everything I want to cover with the low achieving children in terms of the teaching sequence, how we do the sequence, where we support our children, what we support them with, and the elements of transcription that we really need to focus on, really, because I really think that is where our children's difficulties lie, the physical act of writing. And if we get them to have the compositions equal to their peers, and we close the gap of transcription, we've got more chance of getting them up to ARE than we have done in the past, which would be fabulous. I'm not going to keep you any longer. It is 6 o'clock. So I'm going to say thank you very much. If there are any questions you want to ask, you can stay and I will answer any questions you want. But other than that, I will let you go.